breathing, sleep, and the emotions go together. It's a triangle. Because if your mind is racing, it's going to affect your breathing patterns. You're typically going into that fight or flight response. But if your breathing is a little bit fast in upper chest, that's feeding back into a stress. And if your mind is racing, you're not likely to fall asleep so quickly. And I think most people will realize that, if you've had a bad day and you've worries going through your head and you go to bed at night, you're not going to fall asleep as quickly as you would do. You're likely to be twisting and turning, and you've all of this internal monologue going on. So stress impacts our sleep, but if we have a poor night's sleep, it's going to contribute to our stress levels. So breathing, stress, and the emotions are interlinked. And yet, for some reason in Western health, we're focusing on the emotions completely in one field, sleep is completely in another field, and breathing is another field, and nobody is talking to each other.
Hey, my friend, welcome back to another show. Today we catch up with Patrick McKeown, the author of the best-selling book, The Oxygen Advantage. Now, he just wrote this new book that I would highly recommend. The first 100 plus pages are practical tips that can help you functionally breathe better, change the cadence, and actually can help you breathe less and engage more of the muscles of your diaphragm to help you get more out of your breathing. Now, he gets into a lot of different specific health conditions in this book, from poor COVID outcomes to diabetes to epilepsy to female breathing issues to low back pain. A large percentage of people that have low back pain have dysfunctional breathing, sleeplessness, anxiety. There's a whole bunch of things in this book, and it's heavily referenced, and I know you love science and references, so I think you'll really enjoy today's discussion with him, but also the book, The Breathing Cure, is really, really amazing. So one of the things that we're going to talk about a lot in today's conversation, in addition to some of the things that I mentioned, and including female breathing and how female breathing is different, but also we know that a lot of females have trouble with their sleep, especially as they age. Now, one thing that has been shown to help several females and a lot of our clients and customers is a clean hemp oil. So now this isn't a surefire thing for every single person that has dysfunctional sleep or is getting up in the middle of the night or has a racing mind before bed, but it's something to consider because it does help to foster a deeper restorative sleep and help to calm down that monkey mind before bed. So one of the products that we recently launched with our sister business, Myoscience, is clean hemp oil, which is 100% organic. It's certified glyphosate-free, and it's certified non-GMO. So that's something to consider. You can put a drop under your tongue, let it sit there for 30 or 40 seconds, about a half an hour, 45 minutes before bed, and that can help you fall asleep faster without perturbing some of your key sleep stages and cycles that are necessary for neurologic repair and memory formation and so forth. So you can give this a try over on our website and use the coupon code podcast at checkout. That website is myoscience.com. That's myoscience.com, MYOXCIENCE. The product that you might want to consider is clean hemp oil, and it tastes great. It's really easy to use. It's something that's non-habit forming, but it may help you foster a deeper night's sleep. So with that, friends, let's cut back to it with Patrick McKeown. So Patrick, I want to thank you for coming on, and thank you for your work. I feel like your work has been really picked up by a lot of people in the sports and conditioning and athletes, but obviously breath and slowing down the cadence of breath and focusing on kind of the triad that I would like you to talk about, the biochemical, biomechanical, and cadence, applies to so many different chronic conditions, from asthma, anxiety, heart issues, sleeplessness. I mean, there's so many different conditions, and I feel like this is a perfect time. I mean, amid a respiratory virus pandemic, unfortunately, there hasn't been much emphasis on how we breathe, especially how we breathe while we're sleeping, breathing through the nose versus the mouth. But what sort of inspired you to help? Obviously, there's a lot of chronic conditions, but what inspired you to write this new book and then help the medical community and people with medical conditions learn some of the science that they may not have heard before?
Yeah, I think with breathing, probably it's had a bad rap, Mike, over the years. And a lot of people teaching breathing exercises and not really knowing the physiology behind it. I can remember myself, I was after reading a book that was written back, 96, 97, called Calm. And I was going into an exam and I was anxious. And I started taking these full big breaths because that's what it said. It told me to take full big breaths. And I walked into the exam hall, totally lightheaded, spaced out. So you can imagine going in to sit a 3-hour examination of your finals and you've just done a spate of hyperventilation outside, and it's entirely the wrong thing to do. And that was the information, people were just, given certain information about that, no foundation, not helping people, because if you're giving the wrong information, it's not going to work anyway. And breathwork didn't evolve, and I don't think it grew, and people didn't realize the potential of it, because there was so much information, incorrect information at times being put out there. So with the new book, I think it was just more looking at the application of it in terms of, and trying to bring the science where we could. If we think of the autonomic nervous system, the automatic functioning of the human body, it's through the breath, and it's probably the breath is the main function that we can influence the autonomic nervous system, whether we want to upregulate, to stress the body a little bit to get adaptations, or to downregulate, to dampen the stress response, to bring the body into relaxation. And then the application for sleep, the application for movement, physical exercise, anxiety. Like, even if we were to tap into each one of those, you could write probably 5 or 6 books on each single topic relating breathing to them. And female breathing, it has been known that female breathing is different to male breathing since 1905. And yet many females are not aware of it, and very few people are teaching the importance of breathing specifically for females. Epilepsy, diabetes type 1, obstructive sleep apnea. Obstructive sleep apnea is probably going to be the most common chronic health condition that's affecting the Western world. And it's associated with a lot of different conditions, including high blood pressure, cardiovascular issues, heart attack and stroke. It increases the risk of dementia. It can contribute to cancer. And yet very few people have been talking about the importance of nose breathing during sleep. So I wanted to, it's not that the information that I was bringing to the table is not new. The information has always been out there, but it seems to be buried in the medical journals and the literature. And sometimes the amount of studies are very scant, and we would love to see more research. It's starting to happen. It really is. I feel that, I would say, the year 2020 has been the year of the breath. And I would say that there's now a breathing revolution taking place. And we only know it by our own workload. We can't keep up. We literally cannot keep up. And, it's brilliant, because we are seeing something that I've been involved with for 20 years. And at the start, it was kind of a little bit on the fringes. And now it's starting to get out there, and I suppose innovators, we're still at the early adopter stage. It still hasn't gone mainstream. But if people were to look at the full application of breathing, and it's not just about breathing through your nose, of course, it's a good foundation. It's not just about breathing low or breathing deep. And I suppose another aspect in terms of breathing is that we're typically trained in breathing according to different tradition. So if you have one instructor or practitioner who's been trained according to this tradition, that's it. They cannot deviate outside of that. And even they're you hear it in, for instance, trainers don't want them deviating outside of it. But yet you've got these very narrow kind of domains or fields that people are working with in terms of breathing. And with the oxygen advantage, it gave me a lot of freedom. It gave me a freedom because I wasn't constrained by any pre-existing tradition, and I could bring in anything and everything. And we started off with 12 or 14 different breathing exercises, primarily for sports performance. And now we've increased it to 26. So we've doubled it, and we'll continue to expand. We've brought in exercise. To give you an example, people with anxiety and panic disorder, and this is often something that really, I really wonder what's going on here. 75 to 80% of the population with anxiety and panic disorder have dysfunctional breathing patterns. Cognitive training does not have that. And also then, if you talk to them, they often have poor sleep. So, why is this group, why aren't they trained in terms of functional breathing? And why is their sleep quality not looked at? And this is just the mental health population. And the application of this, say, from a biochemical point of view, is that we can breathe light. We have the person breathe a little bit lighter. They feel air hunger. And it's desensitizing their body's reaction to the feeling of suffocation, which is very important. because oftentimes the fear of suffocation will feed into their symptoms. But also with air hunger, which indicates that carbon dioxide is increased in the blood, it's helping to improve blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain. And this has a calming effect on the central nervous system. And then we teach them to breathe low. And the diaphragm, of course, is not just for respiration, but is also connected with the emotions. So we have a calming effect. And then we teach them to breathe slow, to stimulate the vagus nerve, to improve heart rate variability, to improve the sensitivity of the baroreflex. And then we look at their sleep, because a lot of people, when you talk to them with insomnia and obstructive sleep apnea, and when both go together, depression rates are higher. So we as the human body, I suppose Western medicine has divided the human body into, several different separate components without looking at the interplay between each. And breathing, sleep, and the emotions go together. It's a triangle. Because if your mind is racing, it's going to affect your breathing patterns. You're typically going into that fight or flight response. But if your breathing is a little bit fast in upper chest, that's feeding back into a stress. And if your mind is racing, you're not likely to fall asleep so quickly. And I think most people will realize that, if you've had a bad day and you've worries going through your head and you go to bed at night, you're not going to fall asleep as quickly as you would do. You're likely to be twisting and turning, and you've all of this internal monologue going on. So stress impacts our sleep. But if we have a poor night's sleep, it's going to contribute to our stress levels. So breathing, stress, and the emotions are interlinked. And yet, for some reason in Western health, we're focusing on the emotions completely in one field, sleep is completely in another field, and breathing is another field, and nobody is talking to each other. And yeah, it's kind of with the new book, it was a big one. It's probably, it's the biggest book that I've written in terms of words. It's 190,000 words.
Whoa.
And, I suppose I wanted to try and bring together as much of the science. And you've always got that balance, you don't want it too sciencey that it's going to put people off. So what I did was I put everything into the first 2 chapters. So the first 100 pages of all of the exercises and a brief summary of everything. So somebody who doesn't want to read all much, you get it all in the first 100 pages. But then if you wanted to dig deeper into the vagus nerve, into functional movement, into female breathing, into epilepsy, into diabetes, into asthma, into stress, you have separate chapters if sleep, children's development. So that's why, and I took out a lot of information, because I suppose if I kept going, it probably would never have been printed, because even for us, I don't have a copy of it close, but to send it in the post, it's a big one. So it is.
It's a thick one. And publishers get a little weird about that, right? Because their margin and then the price and everything. I ordered mine a couple of weeks ago. I'm still waiting for it. So unfortunately, I haven't read all the way through that, but I've tuned into a lot of your content, and a lot of what you said there, I would love to unpack, especially female breathing. But first, if we could talk about the panic anxiety side of things, because it's funny, I've never really talked about this, but in my professional career, it was like 2010 or 11, I all of a sudden because I've been in sales my entire life, and I would go into these meetings, and they generally kind of followed a similar format, and I would have this sort of panic type. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a one-off. I had too much coffee or whatever, but it was usually like a small confined room towards the back, and I would sort of like lose my breath and start to feel like, oh, my world's closing in. What the heck is going on? And I got good at sort of changing the topic and asking the client or potential customer a question so that I could calm myself down. But then the challenge, Patrick, is your brain gets really good at going to that negative panic state. And it wasn't until, I really started to focus on meditation and yoga and then learn nasal breathing and so forth from Mark Bahena. And that whole thing totally went away. And it wasn't until I was listening to some of your classes that I made that connection between my breath and things like that and improving my sleep. And now I could speak in front of 1,000 people and might be a little nervous beforehand, but after 20 seconds, like I'm good. Whereas 10 years ago, I would have been a wreck, right? So I think it is part of this. You mentioned the CO2, and then we talked about fast breathing, and then the vagal nerve and the focus on the exhalation. If we were to break down the mechanisms by which focusing on, proper functional breathing, how is that affecting anxiety and panic?
I suppose throughout our evolution, whenever we as human beings, if we were confronted by stress, or if we were confronted by, say, wild animal, it's typically the example used, we go into this fight or flight, and it's always accompanied by faster and upper chest breathing. So human beings, whenever we are stressed physiologically, we go into fast and upper chest breathing. But when we consider that many people have dysfunctional breathing patterns, and their primary mode of breathing is a little bit faster in upper chest, and that's kicking back and feeding into their stress response. So these people are almost as if they are teetering on the brink, that they're just on the edge, and all it would take is a little bit of a stress to push them over. And those people especially would be people prone to panic disorder, people prone to a little bit of anxiety, and racing mind. Racing mind is so common out there, Mike. People, like, I would have had a racing mind, but I wouldn't have associated, back in the day, I wouldn't have associated myself as being anxious, but I was pretty highly strung. And, faulty breathing patterns will definitely feed into this. So just as fast and upper chest breathing is synonymous with stress, how do we bring the body into relaxation? We have to look at the exhalation here, because the inspiration during rest or the inhalation is primarily under the sympathetic control. So that's part of the fight or flight response. And it's the exhalation, the primary driver of the exhalation is the parasympathetic response, the parasympathetic nervous system. So it's under rest and digest. If we want to stress the body, so for example, if people are doing Wim Hof, they do stressor, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. It's a stressor, stressing the body. But if we want to bring the body into relaxation, you could take a relatively fast breath in, because it's the breath in that doesn't matter all that much. It's the exhalation that's the key. So if the exhalation is fast, it's a stressor. And if the exhalation is slow and prolonged, it's a relaxant. And basically that information, so you think of the vagus nerve, and again, around a long time, 1913, I think it was, when Lowy, he isolated the heart of a frog, and he was, by stimulating the vagus nerve, which is wandering throughout the human body, he was able to get the nerve to secrete a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is causing a slowing down of the heart. So when we have that prolonged and relaxed exhalation, we're stimulating the vagus nerve. And stimulating the vagus nerve has so many different important functions. It was only in 1998 that a neuroscientist called Kevin Tracy, he found that by electronically stimulating the vagus nerve, that he could reduce harmful inflammation. So if we think of inflammation throughout the human body, and I suppose it may make sense because we as human beings, I don't think we're able to cope well with long-term stress. We've never had to cope with long-term stress throughout our evolution. It was generally short-term stress. Now the modern era is long-term stress. And, how stress is really implicated in causing people to be sick, including increased inflammation. And we can also bring not just in psychological stress, but physiological stress, bad diet, etc. Eating a lot of sugar and all of those things that can contribute to inflammation. So we can alter our state by changing our breathing. And there's a couple of things that are going on. We can improve blood flow, we can improve oxygen delivery. And that's not about taking that full big breath, because many people think, this is what it's all about. That's, the harder we breathe, the more we blow off too much carbon dioxide. And as we get rid of too much carbon dioxide from the blood through the lungs, blood vessels constrict. And it's very common for people with dysfunctional breathing patterns to have cold hands and cold feet and brain fog. And I remember when I was doing this myself, because the thing about breathing exercises are, if you can get pretty quick results, you understand it. You don't need to know the theory. If I have a child coming in and the child has a stuffy nose, and I say to the child, I'm going to show you now how to decongest your nose. You take a normal breath in through your nose and out through your nose, and you pinch your nose and you hold, and you gently nod your head up and down, holding your breath. And then child lets go and he breathes in through his nose. And I'm saying, does it feel any different to breathe through your nose? Do this, block one nostril, breathe in through it, through the other. We're listening. We can feel, we can hear it as well if there's a sense of nasal decongestion. That's all that matters to that child. He doesn't need to know the theory. Does it work or not? And back 20 whatever years ago, when I was first coming across the importance of nose breathing, I always had cold hands, and I started slowing down the speed of my breathing, but not just slowing down the speed of my breathing a little bit less air. I'm breathing a little bit less air to the point of air hunger, which would signify that carbon dioxide had increased in the blood. And I noticed that the temperature of my hands changed. They got warmer. And again, that gave me something, because how on earth can I improve my blood circulation simply by breathing a little bit less air? And despite that information, you think of how many studios around the world that are teaching breathing. And okay, you don't have it so much today with COVID, but 30 or 40 people inside the studio, and you have an instructor there, and the instructor is likely to be telling the person to take these full big breaths. There's a time to focus on the biomechanics, but if you're focusing on the biomechanics, don't sacrifice the biochemistry. Don't just focus on the biochemistry alone. If you're teaching improved biochemistry, you also need to look at the biomechanics, and you need to look at resonance frequency breathing. We can't just look at resonance frequency breathing without looking at the biomechanics and the biochemistry. And that's the thing about breathing, is that functional breathing is encompassing the three dimensions. And we can even go further than that. It's not just about functional breathing during rest, but how do you breathe when you're asleep? How do you breathe when you're doing physical exercise? Like the whole sleep world, Dr. Christian Guilleminault coined obstructive sleep apnea. So he was a French doctor from Stanford. Now, he passed on, I think, in 2019. But for the last 4 or 5 years of his life, he spoke about the critical importance of restoring nasal breathing during sleep. Now, here you have probably one of the founding fathers of sleep medicine talking about it, and it hasn't trickled down yet. If we want to achieve deep sleep, nasal breathing is the key. And I wrote an article that was published a month ago with 2 ear, nose, and throat doctors, and it's breathing and the phenotypes of sleep apnea, because sleep apnea, for men especially, 26% of men aged between 30 and 50 years of age, and 43% of men aged between 50 and 70, 43%. And for females, it's 9% of females aged between 30 and 50, and post-menopausal, it increases 200 to 300%. So you're talking about 18 to 27%. And yet, nasal breathing is helping to open up the architecture of the upper airway. It allows the tongue in the correct resting posture. It ensures that the throat is going to be moist, so that if the throat does collapse, that it doesn't stick because of dryness. It's helping to reduce inflammation. Also, when you breathe through your nose, it increases lung volume. Nasal breathing is activating the diaphragm. Increased lung volume causes a stiffening of the throat. Nasal breathing helps to stabilize blood gases. Nasal breathing is harnessing nasal nitric oxide. And all of that information about the nose, and yet how many sleep doctors are actively encouraging their patients to breathe through it? And it's sometimes, so yeah, like with the new book, I suppose I'm getting a little bit bolder as well, because I'm saying, what's going on here? Like, what on earth is going on? Why are people with asthma not taught to breathe through their nose? I was that kid with asthma. I was that kid with sleep disorder breathing, because if we have asthma, we typically don't just have a problem with the lungs. We're also more likely to have a stuffy nose. And if we have a stuffy nose, we are 2 to 3 times more likely to have sleep disorder breathing. So, it's really kind of one of those. And I remember we were in a panel discussion, and I wrote about it in the book, and there were experts in their field from around the world, and they understand breathing. There's some tremendous orthodontists get it. There's some amazing ear, nose, and throat doctors get it, and medical doctors get it. But the industry hasn't changed. The industry doesn't get it. Like, we're dependent on pockets of healthcare professionals here, and they're not necessarily communicating with each other. And the industry, and I don't know, what's influencing the industry. They don't seem to want, maybe because there's a vested interest in the status quo, and that can be part of it. And the whole discussion come up, well, when is breathing through the nose going to be accepted in terms of craniofacial development in children? Why has it been 110 years being in debate and nothing has moved forward on it? And, yes, there are many questions there that are not answered. For how long does the child have to be mouth breathing before it has a negative effect on the shape of the face? How much nasal obstruction is necessary to cause the child to switch to mouth breathing? For how long, or at what age, if the child starts mouth breathing, does it have the biggest impact? We don't know these questions, but do we really need to know them? Because we have to consider that it's logical and common sense. And the one point that I made during the talk was, if there was a promise of profit by telling your patient to breathe through your nose, I can absolutely guarantee you that everybody would know about it. But there's no promise of profit. There's no promise. If that child comes in with their mouth open and you're writing a prescription and you give it to the parent and the child, there's nothing beneficial. There's no financial reward to that person, to that healthcare professional. But it's a pity that it takes profit to drive things forward.
It really is a shame. And what's interesting is how the mainstream media sort of positions this. My daughter, she's 8 years old now, and we've been doing the myo brace since she was 5, and completely changed. I had her mouth taping when she was 4 before bed. And of course, I call them Karens on social media, said, you're going to kill your daughter. What if she pukes? What if she hiccups? What if she this? She's still alive and thriving, for those that were concerned back then. But my brother was kind of interested. He's younger than me, and he consumes different media than I do. He sent me this New York Times article. There was essentially a smear campaign about the Mew method and Buteyko. And I thought, gosh, this is interesting, right? Because for months we heard from the New York Times and CNN and MSNBC, every life matters. We need to, you need to wear a mask and all this. But yet, here we have this, this time-tested modality of breathing through this organ, this appendage called your nose that is functional. And this article is a smear campaign saying this is invalidated. Orthodontics don't believe in this and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, I just said, okay, thanks, for sending that to me. I don't know why you sent that to me, but it was really interesting. Again, like you're talking about a free therapy. It's our breath is with us, like whether you want to or not. You are breathing no matter what, throughout the day. So you might as well learn how to properly do this, and not exploit it to a sense to your advantage to help make your life more functional. But it is interesting how the specialists who it's a threat to the status quo, like you said. And I think, even if their intentions are more altruistic and not nefarious, it seems that it's like this free thing that it's almost like when something doesn't, like an intervention doesn't cost a lot of money and it's free and it's accessible, we kind of relegate it to well, if nothing else works, try that, but it's not going to be the breakthrough because we have these new technological advancements, the $6,000 therapy that's the breakthrough, and the shiny object syndrome, and people sort of fall for that. Is that what you've sort of seen?
I think it's the Western world, isn't it? Something about the Western psyche that bigger is better. And when it's too simple, it doesn't warrant attention. But if we ask, what does the mouth do in terms of breathing? Does the mouth perform any single function? Is there even one function performed by the mouth when it comes to breathing? And the answer is no. The mouth has no function whatsoever. The only thing the mouth is it's a hole, and it allows air to come in through the mouth straight down the lungs. If you think about the human nose, the nose since the early 1970s has been talked about performing 30 different functions in the human body. There are some papers showing that nasal breathing helps with memory. Breathing through the nose because of the air sniffing out danger, for example. The olfactory nerve in terms of choosing mates. There's so much going on that's with the humble nose, and the fact back in 1988 that individuals who had jaw surgery, that they were forced to breathe through their nose afterwards, the pressure of oxygen in the blood, the PO2 in millimeters of mercury, increased by 10%. Nasal breathing is directly activating your diaphragm. Your diaphragm breathing muscle is not just for respiration, performs many important functions, lymphatic drainage. It also generates what's called intra-abdominal pressure, which is providing stabilization for the spine. 50% of people with lower back pain have dysfunctional breathing patterns. And when you breathe through the nose and you're taking the air deeper into the lungs, the greatest concentration of blood in the human lungs is in the lower regions. So I think, yeah, it's really that thing, it's really amazing, but word is starting to get out now. It's really, there's something definitely happening, which is tremendous. And if I'm to think what would be the single biggest thing, I think it's sleep and I think it's mental health are the two biggest things, because neither in the industry are being dealt with adequately. If we look at children, the gold standard of treatment for a child with sleep disorder breathing, which includes, just by the way, snoring. Child doesn't have to have severe sleep apnea or anything like that. Academic achievement with children who have sleep disorder breathing, they have 10 times the risk of learning difficulties. And also children with their mouth open, their which is a contributory factor in sleep disorder breathing. It affects their cognitive development. So there was a paper published by Karen Bonuck, Bonuck, in Pediatrics in 2012, looking at 11,000 children in Stratford-upon-Avon. And children with sleep disorder breathing, if untreated by age 5, these children had a 40% increased risk of special education needs by age 8. Now, coming back to sleep, you are right. The one thing that's a little bit controversial in what we do is we still are, of course, taping them out. And I would like to kind of show you, if you don't mind, what
Sure.
we've done the last couple of years. I always had an issue with kids. How on earth are we going to get children breathing through the nose? We don't want to be putting the tape across their lips. Now, and I did it with my own daughter, because you're weighing it up and you're saying, okay, I would need her breathing through the nose. I don't want her having the same issues that I had as a kid growing up. So we developed the myotape.
Mm.
And this is, I don't know if you've seen this, but it
Yeah.
can kind of give you an idea. And we have it for children as well. So, for example, we have children, especially during wakefulness. And this is the adults one that I have here. So we stretch the tape about 40%. And it surrounds them out and it brings the lips together. So there's an elastic tension there. Now, I think that's very important as a training tool for kids, because before that, if you can imagine children, why are children breathing through the mouth? One is they could have nasal obstruction. We want to isolate, where is the nasal obstruction? Is it the front of the nose or is it the back of the nose? We have them do the breathing exercises, help open up the nose. And if they can breathe easier through the nose, then we know it's more likely to be the front of the nose. And then we have the kids do walking and jogging and running around with their mouth closed. And we have them wear the tape when they're inside in the clinics, or, for example, if it's online. So we want to establish that the child can functionally breathe through their nose. And then then we know that the child is able to breathe through their nose, but we also have to change the behavior. And changing the behavior is when we get the children to wear tape around their mouth for between half an hour and 45 minutes every day, especially when they are distracted, because kids are kids.
Yeah.
They're watching television, they have a lapse of concentration, and the mouth is open. And the elasticity of the tape is, anytime that they forget about it, they feel the elasticity, which is going to help bring it. It reminds them, and it's continuously. So as opposed to a parent, we'd have parents coming in and the parent feels like they're a broken record, because they keep on saying to the child, breathe through your nose, lips together, mouth closed, etc. And the child is fed up, because all they're doing is hearing mom or dad constantly nagging at them. So the tape saved, that kind of aspect of it. The child is wearing the tape. If the child forgets to breathe through the nose, the tape is going to remind them. And it's that continuous reinforcement of nasal breathing, both during rest and also during sleep. And then, I suppose, children, if you ask children to put a piece of white tape, which you could use, but then children want to talk, they pull it off. They want to drink, they take a drink of water, they've pulled it off. Whereas with the tape surrounding the mouth, they can continue doing it. So, yeah, there's sometimes support needed, and that's the one thing. And a tape that surrounds the mouth, there's no risk, so nobody can say that, well, what happens if you have to breathe through your mouth? If you have to breathe through your mouth, you breathe through your mouth. All the tape is just a gentle reminder during sleep and wakefulness is to bring your lips together, because we want to change the behavior. The New York Times article was an interesting one. I don't think the journalist, I don't think it was totally critical. Actually, in some ways, he did, he kind of highlighted that one orthodontist, a prominent orthodontist from the United States, said that John Mew, in quote, was an idiot. And God, he let himself down by saying something like that.
Mhm.
To say, to call somebody an idiot and to make it public and live, like, that's quite, it's not what you would expect from a person that's well educated and that's in that position. And, in fairness to John Mew, he has been pretty much saying that if you can get your lips together with your tongue resting on the roof of the mouth, your face will grow the way nature has intended. That's all he's saying. He's not coming up with anything dramatic, you know. And he really, what John Mew was asking, and not just John, but John is one of the people who is driving it, and Mike Mew as well. John is talking about, you know, how come human beings, we are the species with crooked teeth, and we didn't always have crooked teeth. Yeah, you could say the dog is a crooked teeth. Well, we screwed up the dog. We crossbred them. There's some breeds that their face is so caved in that if you bring them out, a pug, or if you bring out one of the little bulldogs, you bring them out in a very hot day, they can't have compromised breathing. But we've messed with that. But if you were to look at animals in the wild that haven't been messed up by humans, you will see that they are innate nasal breathers. They have good facial development. Our ancestors had that. And, sometimes John, and I like the guy because I think he's a good guy, a great guy. He can get a little bit passionate about what he's doing. And in the process, then he can be a little bit overcritical of the other side. So
Mhm.
he probably hasn't, and maybe he's right, maybe he's not right. I don't know. But, there's that kind of balance. But I can understand where he's coming from, because if you're saying something for 40 and 50 years and you see it in your practice, and I've sat in his practice for 1 year, on and off, over and back. And I brought my own daughter before COVID, and he gave me permission to sit in the couch, and the parents gave me permission. And I watched him working with the kids. And I wrote a book back in 2010 on that called Buteyko Meets Dr. Mew, because I
Mm.
thought it was a lovely marriage, breathing and Dr. Mew, the two coming together. And I spoke with the parents, and I was able to see the really full facial growth of the children. And Mew said, it's not just about getting the teeth straight. We have to consider the airway. Look at the work of Dr. William Hank from Magura Hills in California. A tremendous orthodontist, and one that I've often went over and back to as well. An understanding that, yes, the airway is the most critical function of the human body. If we were unfortunate enough to get CPR, what does the emergency responder, what's the first thing they do? They check the airway. But yet in dentistry, the dental industry has such a tremendous role to play in this, because they can spot the risk factors for sleep apnea. Any dentist, they're looking into the child or adult's mouth. They will be able to check if the child is a high upper narrow palate. They'll be able to check if there's inflammation on the throat, if there's scalping on the tongue, if the child or adult is a mouth breather. And, we go to our dentists more often than we go to our medical doctors, especially men. Like, men are the high risk here with sleep apnea. We don't go to the medical doctor unless we're on our knees. That's the reality of it. But we're going to our dentist every 6 months. And our dentist is ideally trained and in an ideal position to spot for sleep apnea in the adult population, and at least say, look, Mr. McKeown, there's something I think you need to investigate it a bit further, If you don't investigate it, it could lead to this, or whatever. At least give them that advice. And that's not happening, and something that the industry should be talking about.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I can understand how the passion can be misconstrued. I'm sure if people were to look at my Instagram and be like, well, you're anti-medicine or this or that, because I poke fun at the fact that, during a respiratory virus pandemic, we closed gyms but kept McDonald's open, right? So I totally understand that. But going back to, some of the things that you mentioned earlier that I know our listeners would folks tuning in would still really like to know more about. You talked about female breathing. And then CO2 is the primary drive to breathe. And you have a little test that will tell people about their CO2 tolerance. And so I think those two concepts are pretty interesting and new. Can we kind of dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So female breathing, it's been known since 1905 that female breathing is different than male breathing. And how is it different? It's because of hormonal changes in the female. So, for example, during the monthly cycle, post-ovulation, days 10 to days 22, which will be mid-luteal phase, that there's an increase in a hormone called progesterone. And progesterone is a respiratory stimulant. And basically, with the female, breathing is likely to become faster and maybe a little bit more upper chest, and breathing becomes harder. And this in turn then is causing too much carbon dioxide to be removed from the blood through the lungs. So CO2 in the blood can drop by as much as 25%. Now, what does this mean then in terms of, well, pain perception increases, pain thresholds lower, sleep can be impacted, anxiety and panic can contribute to feeling of air hunger, and many of the symptoms, for example, of PMS. So we really need to be looking at the female's breathing pattern, especially a female. Now, of course, genetics is going to play a role here, and I'm not saying that all females are going to experience the same thing. But if you already have a female with relatively poor breathing, and if she's already breathing a little bit fast in upper chest, and then she goes through the luteal phase, she's going to have an exacerbation of her breathing there. And I think it's really important that she tracks her breath hold time, as you spoke about there. We call it the Bolt score and oxygen advantage, the control pause and the Buteyko method. I think it's important for females to track their Bolt score and to check, is there any change in their breathing throughout the monthly cycle? And it's really weird because most of the research done on breathing has been done by men, and even the research done by females failed to take into account the monthly cycle. And there's other papers showing that you're going to have females that would meet the diagnostic criteria for fibromyalgia between days 10 and days 22, but outside of it, they don't. And then you have to wonder then, why is temporomandibular joint pain so much more common in the female population? Why is the predisposition to panic disorder so much more common? So this is just something, why not just look at the female breathing? And also, there has been intervention showing that when you slow down the breathing rates of the female PMS, that in turn then reduced the symptoms and they had a better and improved quality of life. So I think there's definitely a direct connection there. That the research is still scanty, but I think the first step would be for a female, if she wants to, is to track her Bolt score. And just to see, does her Bolt score dip between days 10 and days 22? Because that would suggest that you have got a tendency towards hyperventilation. And if you do have symptoms such as increased pain, etc., that it could very well be that hyperventilation. And all that means is that your breathing is a little bit faster and a little bit upper chest. And you mightn't even notice it. Like the only thing that you might notice is, I just feel that I can't take a satisfying breath. Or I just feel that you feel a bit of air hunger. It's not that you're in an anxiety attack. It's not that you're in a panic attack. Just your breathing is a little bit faster and a little bit harder, and how that can impact symptoms. And the other aspect then is post-menopausal women, between, say, the ages of 50 and 55 or thereabouts, that sleep disorder breathing can increase 300%. And we've had reports of people sending emails back to us, because there's quite a few of us on the ground, that women having hot flushes or hot flashes, that once they got their mouth closed during sleep, that it reduced the symptoms. And then we have to think of the autonomic nervous system here. If we think of heart rate variability, or if we think of an objective measure of vagal tone, people who are not well, either physically or mentally, will have reduced HRV. They typically have reduced vagal tone. And then we have to wonder, well, how can we stimulate the vagus nerve? And we can stimulate the vagus nerve by doing a number of things. One is nasal breathing during sleep, because it has been shown amongst our own instructors. Like Mike, we have 700 people affiliated with us, 400 with Buteyko Clinic International and 300 with Oxygen Advantage. And they're people who have done the training. but also completed the exams, and they're listed. And then, of course, you're going to have a cohort of people who do the training, but they mightn't necessarily do the formalities of it. So we get the feedback from that large group of instructors sending information back to us. And, you know, sometimes they have questions because we don't have the answers. And we're always doing that little bit of digging, but this is how we're learning with it. And yeah, so in terms of hot flashes and hot flushes and the autonomic nervous system, you know, that we can influence that from a number of ways. And one is nasal breathing during sleep. And that's where waking up in a dry mouth in the morning is not ideal. The sleep quality is likely to be lighter. Sleep apnea is much more severe. There was a paper published in Laryngoscope in May of 2020 looking at individuals. They were young people, like I'm saying young because I'm that age, 45 years of age to 51 years of age. And the individuals who are open mouth breathing had double the severity of sleep apnea versus the nasal breathing group in terms of the AHI index. Their AHI with mouth breathing alone was 52 events per hour, which is almost one every minute. It's crazy. And with nasal breathing, it was 27 events per hour, which is bordering on severe, but it's still half the severity of the mouth breathing group. And out of the 95 individuals with established obstructive sleep apnea, only 35 of them were predominantly nasal breathing. 60% of the population were either solely mouth breathing or switching from mouth to nose breathing. So we know that about 50% of the adult population persistently mouth breathe. How on earth are we going to have recovery if we're not getting good sleep? You know, it is the foundation. And there is a reason why nature has devoted that we spend 8 hours or whatever, 6 to 8 hours in a state of sleep, because it really is. It's allowing, you know, the brain to clean itself, etc., and all of those good things. And we feel it when we wake up. Like when I switched from mouth to nose breathing, whatever, 98, the second day that I wore tape on my mouth, I woke up feeling an alertness that I had never experienced in 15 years. And this is what sometimes frustrates me, because I was going to school, to university, and I didn't have the concentration. I was falling asleep. I was so stuck in my head. I was highly strung. Didn't think I was anxious, but for me to get my grades, it was 12 hours a day of studying. Now, can you imagine? You know, like here is society is determining if a child is academically, if they're intelligent. They're determining the high school kid or the university graduate. Here's an intelligent person. They've got a first class honors degree. Listen, start looking at these kids with poor sleep qualities. You will not get a first class honors degree if you have poor sleep quality. You can be the most intelligent person in the world. If your sleep is screwed up, and if your mind is in a state of, you know, agitation because of that physiological poor breathing pattern, it doesn't matter how intelligent you are. So academic intelligence is not solely based on intelligence. Academic intelligence is influenced by lifestyle factors, and it is influenced by genetics. And unfortunately, society is demanding us that we concentrate, but society is not telling us how to concentrate. And this is the purpose of my current book. So I've started writing it. As I said, the other book was too big, and I had to take some certain sections out of it. And I really feel with this one, because breathing is not just that thing that's in the domains. This is not on the fringes of society. I want to bring breathing into mainstream. This is, you know, if I was to say, if you were to make some sort of contribution that you felt was positive, it would be improved awareness of it. And let's break down the barriers and the resistance. And, you know, really what I'm saying here is that where is this all going to happen with? It's going to happen with the grassroots. And the science is starting to catch up, because when we look at the amount of papers looking at heart rate variability, and I'll come back to that, because you can ask, well, how can you improve your HRV? HRV is a measurement, but so many people, especially performance athletes, military, they're all tracking their data. They're using Whoop, or they're using O-Ring or Elite HRV or Leaf or whatever. They're tracking their data, and that's all fine. That's a measurement. The real question is, how can we improve it? And that's when we're talking about nose breathing during sleep. Also breathe light, so that when we slow down our breathing to feel our hunger, the increased carbon dioxide is vagotropic. It stimulates the vagus nerve. Another aspect is breathing low, that when we have increased amplitude of the diaphragm is also being innervated by the vagus nerve, that we can stimulate the vagus nerve. And another is to breathe slow, between 4.5 and 6.5 breaths per minute. Most people are aware of the breathe slow, but they're not necessarily aware of the breathe low, and most are not aware of breathe light or nasal breathing. So there are a number of ways that we can help to stimulate the vagus nerve, and even small breath holds. Like if we think of, say, people with anxiety of the mind, they may be prescribed mindfulness. If I had anxiety of the mind, the last thing that I would want to do is sit in a corner in the lotus position focusing on my breathing, because it would probably drive me mad. The very fact that I have to bring my attention inwards. Instead, what we do with people coming in with anxiety, I have them do breath holding. Breath holding. They don't even have to think of their breath. But what I'm doing is have them take a normal breath in and out, hold their nose. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let go, breathe in through your nose. Stimulates the vagus nerve. And it also helps to increase blood flow to the brain. So we can calm the central nervous system by doing breath holding. And then when we get the person calmer and we get their sleep improved, during their sleep quality improved, their mind is calmer. And when the mind is calmer, you're more willing then to focus on your breathing. So I actually think the hierarchy of focus and concentration, mindfulness is not the foundation. Mindfulness is towards the top. Let's get your sleep right first. That is the key. You can do all the mindfulness in the world. If you're snoring your head off, and if you're stopping breathing during sleep, and if you're having insomnia, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference. We have to be realistic about it. So sleep is the foundation. Then functional breathing patterns. Look at the biochemistry first to improve blood flow to the brain to have a calming effect on the mind. And then the biomechanics. Then cadence breathing. And then mindfulness. So mindfulness is up here when you're already well on the path. At the moment, it's mindfulness at the bottom. Mindfulness the next layer. Mindfulness the next layer. Mindfulness the next layer. And then we're wondering, so many people with anxiety, they're prescribed mindfulness, they can't do it, and the fall off rate is too high.
Or they don't make it a habit. And this was like myself, you go to a Vipassana or any a silent meditation. I did a 10-week class once a week. We go to and it was great. It was wonderful. But I'm sitting there thinking about all this stuff, and it takes you 20 or 30 minutes of sitting and to the point where you're actually calm. But now that I know all the ins and outs of, I'm not an expert by any means. I've just dabbled, kind of cursory in your work. And I'm like, man, if they could bridge, and that's what you talk about in your courses, like make this a holistic approach where we're talking about the biochemical, not just the biomechanical or the cadence. And that was my challenge. And I think a lot of people, they want to calm down, they want to sleep better, they want to be less stressed. So they do a meditation class or a yoga class, whatever, but they're getting a small piece of the puzzle. And that's what I'm so grateful, for your work, is you're bringing this all together. And if you were to pair some of these super simple modalities, whether it's a Wim Hof type thing or breath holds, then it just sort of accelerates that calming effect. And then the meditation becomes an actual habit, not something that you try for 3 weeks and you say, I suck at this, so I'm not going to do it. So
yeah, it's not going to happen though, Mike. Everybody, I think the nature of the human mind is that we're all protecting our own turf. That's the analogy that's out there. And even if you look at, I've done Vipassana, absolutely amazing. But the first thing that SN Goenka, and tremendous, I've everything positive to say. The first thing he will say is, don't change your breathing. And, we have to bear in mind that mindfulness, when it has originated going back maybe 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago. Life was very different then. And I think there's greater chronic stresses, and there's greater problems with the airway. There's greater dysfunctional breathing patterns that they too need to be addressed. And really we need, like in terms of with the oxygen advantage, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but it gave me the ability to approach it like we do stressor exercises. We do hyperventilation. So we do something similar to Wim Hof as well. It's taken from Tummo Yoga. We have 20 full breaths as opposed to 30. We have an exhale hold, which we had anyway, but then we have to breathe light. Stress the body, but also relax it. Like I just had a podcast with a professional ice hockey player just before I was talking with yourself. And even in sports, in sports, there's a warm up and then you have your practice session, but then there's a warm down. Breathing should be the same. We start off with the bolt score. And actually, we never spoke about that, I don't think.
Let's define it maybe, yeah.
Yeah, so we start off typically with the bolt score, but then we go into little gentle breath holds to warm up the person. And then we go into breathe light, and then we look at breathe light from a biochemical and biomechanical. And then we do light stressor exercises. And then we do harder stressor exercises, but we'll also do exercise then to recover. So I think, if we're stressing the body, let's bring in recovery too. So again, I think it's just to be more encompassing of it and to realize that breathing is very simple, but it's complex at the same time. It's a little bit tricky, but at the same time, don't let anybody, that's not to put anybody off, because you don't have to be an expert to start. You just hone in on one simple little exercise. And, many of them we've put up for free anyway on YouTube. So the BOLT score, what is it? It's a measure of functional breathing patterns. It is influenced by your chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the primary driver to breathe, but it's not the only thing that influences BOLT score. If you had, say, for example, inflammation in your lungs, that information is fed back to the brain, and that will reduce your BOLT score. So people with asthma, or if they have airway narrowing, they can have a lower BOLT score. And then if they take a puff of their Ventolin, straight afterwards, their BOLT score increases. So the fact that the airway narrowing has caused their BOLT score to reduce. It's also impacted by cognitive factors. A person's experience to air hunger. And so, for example, if we have people with trauma, or people, if they were swimming in a swimming pool as a kid, and if some brat got their head and put their head into the water, that we've seen this, we've 40-year-old adult coming in, and once I start getting the adult to start reducing their breathing and they feel air hunger, it brings them back to the trauma of what happened during their childhood. So it's really incredible how the body remembers all of this information, and this can impact their breathing patterns. So in any event, here's the BOLT score. So for your listeners, if you have a second time or whatever, you're sitting down for about 5 minutes, take a normal breath in and out through your nose and pinch your nose and hold. And you're timing it in seconds until you feel the first definite desire to breathe, or the first involuntary movement of your diaphragm. So basically you feel that your breathing gives a bit of a kick. So again, you take a normal breath in through your nose and out through your nose. You pinch your nose and you're timing it in seconds until you feel an involuntary movement of your breathing muscles. And then you let go and you breathe. And your breathing should be normal at the end. So the significance of it is as follows. It's always a measure. It's a measure of functional breathing. It gives you some feedback. It's not perfect. None of these tests are perfect, but it's not bad either. And it was put to the test by a Professor Kyle Kiesel. He's a professor of physical therapy from Evansville University in the United States. And he looked at 51 people. They were 27 years of age, and he looked at their breathing across biochemistry, biomechanical, and a psychophysiological point of view. And his conclusion was that none of them are correlated, as you would expect they were, but they weren't. And an easy breath hold time gives you a good screening tool for the presence of dysfunctional breathing. And he used pretty much the BOLT score, or the control pause from the Buteyko method. His conclusion was, if your BOLT score is above 25 seconds, there is an 89% chance that dysfunctional breathing is not present. So quite an interesting one. We were saying 20 seconds would be the minimum, and 40 seconds was the goal. And he settled at 25 seconds. And people then might ask, well, what happens if I have a lower BOLT score? Well, sleep medicine now has changed, that if you have sleep apnea, and if you've got a BOLT score of 10 to 15 seconds, this could indicate that you have what's called high loop gain. And it means that you've got very unstable breathing during sleep that's feeding in itself. or if you have a very low Bolt score and you've got anxiety, typically a lower Bolt score is associated with faster and upper chest breathing. So it's more likely to keep you stuck in that state of anxiety or fight or flight. If you're doing physical exercise, a lower Bolt score is associated with disproportionate breathlessness. And also, there's a relationship between Bolt score and your breathing patterns and movement. So if your breathing is normal, your movement is more likely to be normal. And conversely, if your breathing is dysfunctional, your movement is more likely to be dysfunctional. And dysfunctional movement patterns, you've got an increased risk of injury. So, you know, like really, it's with breathing that what I say is the hierarchy of breathing. I would always focus with nasal breathing at the bottom. And then I would look at the biochemistry. And the only reason that I would focus on the biochemistry is because you can influence blood flow and oxygen delivery by breathing a little bit less air. And then I would focus on the biomechanics. And then I would focus on the resonance frequency or the frequency of breathing. And I suppose it's that way that, bringing it into your everyday way of life. It's not how you're breathing inside the studio that's the key. It's how are you breathing when you go for a walk? Is your mouth open during your sleep? I suppose ultimately it's about improving our resilience. And the other thing is that for so much in the Western world, there's so many distractions and pressures on people to be surrendering all of their attention outward. And mobile phones and the big tech corporations have really consumed this one. That they've taken so much of people's times and they're consuming people's time. And people seem to willingly give their time to these big companies. It's really amazing. And then if I was to step one step further and I'd say, well, what's the motive of these big companies? Well, these big companies hired psychological and behavioral analysis who know human behavior to create situations almost that we're like little rats in a cage, and you get your little trigger, to get the person addicted to the technology. And unfortunately, kids are in this trap. So, my only point that I would say this is because many people feel that they don't have time to focus on their breathing, but yet they're happy to spend an hour on their phone or to keep on checking their phone. I think it's about 50 times per day is the average that a person is checking their phone. So maybe check your phone less and have your head stuck in your phone less and bring your attention inwards. And focusing on the breath is absolutely one of the best things in terms of quietening the human mind. So focusing on the breath and slowing down your breathing and breathing a little bit lighter, bringing a quietness to the mind and helping to control your mind. As I said earlier on, society demands that we concentrate, but society doesn't teach us how. And what is concentration but our ability to have one pointed focus, 100% of our attention on doing what we are doing without distraction. And for many people, the mind is bombarded with thought. And if you think, well, my mind isn't bombarded with thought, what I would suggest is get a piece of paper and a pen and set a timer for 3 minutes. And set a timer for 3 minutes, and in during that 3 minutes, focus on your breathing. And every time your mind wanders off the breath, give it a tick, give the paper a tick, and keep ticking it every time you notice the mind wandering off. And check how many ticks you have over the course of 3 minutes. So you don't even have, most people, of course, are not going to have the capacity to hold their attention on their breathing for 3 minutes. Some people mightn't even have the attention to hold on their breath for 5 or 6 seconds. And most certainly, attention span and concentration. And we're not just talking about productivity and performance here, but we're talking about happiness. Because it is known that when the mind is wandering, the people with the most agitation of the mind are least happy. Because the thing about the human mind is that oftentimes it's not just that we're thinking a lot, but a lot of the thinking is negative and critical, self-criticism. So it's draining of energy. And if we were worried about something all day long, we know how draining it is, how tired we are, it affects our mood. We're polluting our own inner space, but we're not just polluting our own inner space, we're polluting the space of everybody around us. If you're in a room and somebody walks in foul humor, you don't even have to talk to that person. Already you feel it. you feel it coming up inside you, so we are connecting with each other individually, and not just through the sounds or how we communicate, but there's something else going on there. So the person with the wandering mind and the racing mind, I would really say is really start for your own sake, because our happiness, and it is that all of our life's experiences are interpreted through the human mind. And we never seem to step back and ask, well, what's going on in my mind at the moment? And, a psychologist could write a PhD about how the mind works. It's not the PhD on how the mind works. You could write a PhD on how an orange tastes, or you could get an orange and you can bite into it. I want to taste it. And you'll find that a lot of people, when we talk about the quietness of the mind, and I can understand that when I started doing it at first, I would bring my attention onto my breath, and I wouldn't be focusing my attention on my breathing. I'd be thinking about my breathing because I couldn't escape the head, because we're so encapsulated in that thought. And that's how it is originally. That's how it is initially. And you start to notice that if you have your attention on your breathing, your mind wanders. You bring your attention back, your mind wanders, and it can be frustrating. But the goal is not to be focusing on the breath with an objective of bringing calmness to the mind. The very focus, it's the process that's the key here. It's bringing our attention from the mind onto the breath, or into the body, or into the present moment awareness, and not just having our attention on our breathing, but slowing down our breathing and breathing lightly, because you will find that the mind is more anchored onto the breath when you have a slight air hunger. There's something strange in that. And I think it's because of the calming effect of increased CO2 and increased blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain. So concentration is learned. Now, of course, it's influenced genetically, but we can also train it. And if I was to say what is the biggest tool that any of us will use in our daily life, it's concentration. And it's really, our education system. We are trained how to think. We are trained how to analyze, to break information into tiny pieces. We are not trained how to stop thinking, and we are not trained how to concentrate. So yeah, it's a nice space to start going in, because there's tools here that everybody can use, from the child in school right up to elite military and everybody in between.
Beautifully said. One of the things that I've sort of figured out when I got COVID, in December, one of my first symptoms was my breath retention. It goes back to the BODE score that you mentioned. I knew something was off, and we're all looking for, people are into tracking biometrics, heart rate variability. You mentioned the Oura ring, the Whoop. That to me was like, I woke up on this Tuesday, I'm like, something is off. And then I have this routine of doing breath work and doing the cold shower, and I couldn't take my cold shower. And so this was long before. And so I knew that day, okay, I don't know what this is, but I'm going to wear a mask and distance and all this. So it's interesting, like these small little things that we're talking about, free, accessible, how long can you retain your breath is a proxy or a biomarker into what's going on in your autonomic and potentially immunologic system. So is it normal, Patrick, for this to sort of change based on stress a little bit? I mean, or is it pretty static?
The BOLT score, no, it changes. Many things change it. And I suppose this is what can be frustrating for people. So if you talk a lot during the day, it can negatively affect your BOLT score. If you do physical exercise and you wait and you take your BOLT score about an hour after you finished, your BOLT score is typically improved if your breathing is good during physical exercise. So nasal breathing and, functional breathing during exercise would help there. Anybody who has a head cold, the BOLT score reduces. COVID, we've seen BOLT scores reduced to 3 seconds. And here you have a situation of people with COVID, and they have such labored breathing. And, again, how do you improve that person's breathing? We start off with small breath holds. So we don't do slow breathing. We don't do pursed lip breathing. If your BOLT score is 3 seconds, you can hardly catch your breath. You're not going to be able to talk. And these people, of course, are under medical intervention as well. And despite that, they still have a low breath hold time. So we have them do small breath in, small breath out, hold the nose, 1, 2, let go, just breathe. And again, normal breath in and out through the nose, pinch the nose and hold, 1, 2. And we also talk about then low and slow breathing to improve alveolar ventilation, breathing through the nose. but we start off with small breath holds, and then we start off with small breath hold walking. So even when the bolt score is 3 seconds, we want to give the person a little bit of a stress, the tiniest of a stress, so we're saying during this period of time, don't breathe faster. I want you to actually start stopping your breathing by doing small breath holds. And what that does then is that in turn is helping to slow down your breathing so your bolt score improves. And every time that your bolt score is coming up by 5 seconds, you're going to feel a difference in terms of your breathing. So even with the person with long COVID, and if your nose is constantly stuffy, you can help open it up by doing breath holding. If your breathing is labored, do breath holding. If you want to challenge yourself a little bit more, breathe in through your nose and out through your nose, and pinch your nose and just walk a few paces. And it was this time last year I put a video out on YouTube. Well, I was doing a Zoom, and I was totally unprepared. Kind of, it booked out anyway. 100 people. I just put it out on social media, says I'm going to do a Zoom class for people with COVID, just to talk about breathing. And I booked out. Lighting was terrible, sound was terrible, everything was terrible. And we recorded it anyway because it was oversubscribed. We put it up on YouTube, and 800,000 people have viewed it. But I would say a couple of thousand people have left comments. And if you were to go, I don't check comments, to be honest with you, but if you were to go down through the comments, you will see that people who left them will have used these exercises. I give all of the exercises. So, people with COVID will have left their comments there. And of course, like anything else, it's never going to work for everybody. But at the same time, if you have labored breathing, I would say if I was to choose any sort of exercises, and I'm free to choose whatever exercise I feel works based on my own experience, I would always start off with the small breath holds. It's a lovely little small exercise. We use it too with people with panic disorder, people with anxiety, and people with some of the most dreadful life experiences that they've had. And life sometimes can be pretty tough for some people. How do you how do you stay in that, composure, or even just to help yourself, to just to reduce the stress a little bit? Small breath hold exercise, great little exercise.
Amazing. I love it, Patrick. I'm sure we could talk all day about various tips and strategies and things like that. So you have a master class on your website, oxygenadvantage.com. You're regularly doing courses and everything like that. And then you have a apprenticeship, if people wanted to learn how to be an instructor to spread this knowledge. I think that's fantastic. So the book, is it available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble for folks in the US and Canada?
It's going to be published in July of 2020 in the United States, and I'm assuming in Canada as well. And it's currently available though through our own websites. So we ship it over to the USA. It takes about 10 days, sometimes 2 weeks.
That's fine.
And oxygenadvantage.com or buteycoclinic.com. So it's $25, but that's including the postage. The postage is about $12. So,
that's tough.
As I said at the very start, this is a big book, and you sometimes, it was only till I come in from the printers and I was looking at the size of it, but it's not that people have to read through the whole book just to pull whatever you need, because it's segmented, and that way then you can get the information. You can go in as shallow or as deep as you want.
Awesome. No, I look forward to getting it. Yeah, it's awesome. And I totally understand that we have an e-commerce business, and, unfortunately people are primed, via Amazon to get these things now. Like, whereas I ordered it, we just have to have a little patience, and so I think the wait creates more sort of anticipation. You get excited. I'm checking the mail and all that. There's something a little bit, delaying gratification. I ordered another book from the UK actually, and it took several weeks, and I was totally cool. And then when I got it, it was about Boris Johnson, and it was really good. I was that much more excited waiting. So I'm totally with you on that. I think it's great to support the authors directly and independent bookstores. I'm a huge fan of doing that. And so,
yeah, I would totally, Mike. I think, the future of it, it's so unfortunate. A bookstore, I've always loved the paperback, and going into a bookstore, and how many of them have shut down, and where is it going to end up? We have one company pretty much is going to monopolize the entire book reading industry in the world. And you have to ask, is that for the better?
I don't think so, because then they can screen what books they may or may want to offer,
Yes,
which is
that's true.
really scary. So that's why, yeah, here in the US, I recommend folks go to their local bookstore, when they can and so forth. Sometimes they don't carry everything, but they can special order it. And again, it's like you're supporting a local business. It might take a little bit longer. I do that all the time. So there's this Powell's Books in Portland, and yeah, their website is
Beautiful
obviously not.
city, Portland, Oregon.
Yeah. Have you been there?
Oh,
Nice.
sorry, there, I lost you there. Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
beautiful city, so it is.
it
I've been there
is.
twice. Yeah.
Nice. Sounds good, Patrick. Well, as always, thanks so much for spreading this word and being a consistent voice in this community. It's much needed. Congrats on the new book and the new publishing deal and all that sort of stuff. And appreciate your time.
Great, Mike. Thank you.
Well, friends, that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed that episode. If you did, you can hit that like button. You can leave us some feedback over in iTunes. That really goes a long way, both on YouTube and iTunes. And please support Patrick's work. He is doing a phenomenal job of educating people. He's been doing this for a very, very long time. His book is phenomenal. It's not on Amazon or a bunch of other websites. You have to buy it right through his website, which means you are supporting him. Now, let me just tell you, publishers don't like to print these really heavy books because it's less profit for them. So you're actually helping to support him and helping to improve the circulation of this knowledge, because we are at a critical point here when it comes to breathing and breath work and the idea of nasal breathing and not breathing through the mouth and breathing less and carbon dioxide tolerance and all these fun things that we talked about. So please help share the message. And if you enjoy this, you can share this with a friend or family member, because we want to spread the word that breath is like the new exercise. We should be breathing properly through our nose and slowing down the cadence and becoming more tolerant of carbon dioxide. So as always, I'm just grateful that you tuned all the way to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we will catch you on a future episode down the road. Until then, be well. Bye now.